The quote is a complete fiction. In fact, anybody familiar with the teachings of the Satmar Rebbe knows that he stated, wrote, and taught quite the opposite. One example of many. In the Divrei Yoel Parshas Nosai, he says the fact that people mistakenly think that Israel and the Zionists speak for the Jewish people causes them to, and I quote, become anti-Semites. And therefore, he says, in order to prevent such anti-Semitism, it would be a great mitzvah to explain to the non-Jewish world at large that the Zionists are not the representatives of the Jewish people and that we religious Jews have nothing to do with them. Not only that, but so important was this mission to the Satmar Rebbe to tell the world that Israel does not represent the Jews. And so vital was it, in his opinion, for the safety of the Jewish community that for its sake he made an exception to one of his otherwise ironclad religious rules. You see, in Satmar, like in many Hasidic enclaves, all public addresses are in Yiddish, never in English. All the lectures, classes, school lessons, rabbinic sermons, public announcements. It's part of the Hasidic rules. One exception, though, the Satmar Rebbe made. He said that at every anti-Zionist protest that is held, where all the lectures are in Yiddish, there must be one person, only one, who speaks there publicly in English, so that the press and the public will hear the message that Zionism is not Judaism and the Zionists do not represent the Jews. Saying that the Satmar Rebbe was against telling non-Jews that Israel doesn't represent the Jews is kind of like saying, that the Zohar was against Kabbalah, or if Shamshon Raphael Hirsch was against Torah and Derech Eretz. The Satmar Rebbe regularly planned, promoted, and participated in protests where that was the primary message. And it wasn't only him. Take a look in the Sefer Kisvei Reb Mendel Zaks. You'll find there a picture of the Satmar Rebbe sitting on a dais at a public protest under a large banner that reads, quote, "Our purpose is to safeguard the human rights of our co-religionists in Israel. Hundreds of thousands of religious Jews in Israel are denied such basic rights as freedom of religion." End quote. And on that same dais, together with the Satmar Rebbe, seated under the same banner, is Reb Avram Kalmanovich, the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir Yeshiva, and Reb Mendel Zaks, son-in-law of the Chofetz Chaim, member of the then Moyetzas Gedolei HaTorah, and Rosh Yeshiva in Radin. Now, as regards the story itself, here's what really happened. The source of the story is a Rabbi Chaim Moshe Shtoba, who was there when it happened, and he printed it in his biography of the Satmar Rebbe, which I have here. You know, it's funny that with all the versions of the incident out there, none of the Zionists who tell over the story thought to consult the actual primary source, which is publicly available. This is the way the story goes. When former Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, ran for presidency, he came to see the Rebbe at his home in Williamsburg. The Rebbe's room was full of rabbis, community leaders, and local elected officials. Somehow, Humphrey's advisors did not brief him properly on what to say, or more importantly, on what not to say. So Mr. Humphrey began, as he was coached to do when visiting Jewish leaders, a recitation of his long pro-Israel record. All of those present looked at each other, but the Rebbe was relaxed and smiling. Each time Mr. Humphrey made mention of Israel, the Rebbe winked at one of those present, indicating that he was merely amused. When Mr. Humphrey finished his speech, the Rebbe shook his hand, asked him to sample some of the refreshments on the table, and upon leaving, the Rebbe paid his respects to him by walking him to the door and cordially nodding his head. Now here's the important part. Back in the Rebbe's room, many of us wanted to hear what the Rebbe would say. The Rebbe, who had a very poor command of English, had picked up almost everything Mr. Humphrey said concerning his support for Israel. The Rebbe smiled as he added his commentary, quote, "What should I do? Teach him about the Sholosh Shavuos?" This was just his way of trying to tell us that he's a friend of Yidden. Now, I remember this story. It was fairly well known back in the day. And then, suddenly, I think it was around maybe 15 years ago, if I remember right, the story kind of grew a new limb. Zionists and their sympathizers suddenly started telling the story, but they added a part to it. They said that the Rebbe claimed if a non-Jew is against Israel, that means he's anti-Semitic, something which, of course, he never said. Not long ago, I even called Rabbi Stauber, and I asked him about this, and he confirmed to me that the Rebbe never expressed such an idea, that a non-Jew is anti-Semitic if he's anti-Zionist, and the way he wrote it in the book was all there was to tell. Now, if you look on all these sites that quote the distorted version of the story, you'll find that they never source it. And of course, that's because it has no source. If you do a bit of Googling, you'll see that what appears to be the debut of this fiction was a 2003 article in Aretz Sheva by a Nissen Ratzlaff Katz. The article was called The Wisdom of the Satmar Rebbe. Katz uses the fictitious addendum to the story, for which of course he cites no source, to disparage Jews, who were then explaining to non-Jews that there's a distinction between Zionism and Judaism. That's the first instance of the distortion that I could identify. Now, the only historian who I know of that quotes the story seems to concur. In 2007, Jeffrey Herf came out with a book called Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism in Historical Perspective. In the book, Professor David Myers mentions the story, and he too couldn't find any source. He calls it apocryphal, which of course it is, and the only place he cited for it was, lo and behold, Ratzlaff Katz's article in Aretz Sheva. When the Satmar Rebbe was alive, they used to accuse him of being on the side of anti-Semites and encouraging anti-Semitism because of his activities as well. That was then. Now that the Satmar Rebbe is no longer here, they took another tactic, to say that he was opposed to all those activities that he actually encouraged. The bottom line is, the story, as it appears on these websites, is a fiction. It puts words in the Satmar Rebbe's mouth, words that he never said, that in fact he vehemently opposed. What the Satmar Rebbe did believe is that Zionism is not Judaism, and it's vital for the safety and security of our fellow Jews that we make sure the entire world knows that as well.